Welcome to All About Impact, the official podcast of Imagine If Insights and Strategy. I'm your host, Susan Patoyan. All About Impact is the only podcast in the world that is exclusively dedicated to the art and science of creating real and positive impact with data, research, and insights. We push ambitious marketers, practitioners, and users of data, research, and insights to create meaningful, tangible, real-world impact with their work. Join us as we bring you diverse perspectives from hand-picked impact champions, incredible cross-disciplinary leaders who are masters at activating insights to transform business and achieve unparalleled success for their teams, organizations, careers, and of course, customers. Now is the time to venture into the world of influence and impact far beyond data and insights. Tune in today and boldly unleash the impact champion in you. In this episode of All About Impact, my guest is Dan Casey, Vice President of Consumer Insights and Strategy at the Home Entertainment Division of the world-famous Universal Studios. Dan is an entertainment research veteran who followed the consumer from VHS all the way to today, to digital. He brings an incredible wealth of insight with a distinct set of reality and refreshing humility. And this is why Dan and I chose to discuss something that we rarely talk about, because it's not easy to talk about. And wait for it, that is how to actually fail at research impact. Yes, you heard that right. As a researcher, you might have curiosity among your stakeholders. You may even have many good objectives. And you may feel like you're ready or well on your way to creating impact with your research and insights project. But are you really? Tune in to find out. Hello, hello, hello. Today, I have my good friend and longtime industry colleague, Mr. Dan Casey, joining us today. Dan has been in the industry of research and entertainment in particular for many years. He is the Vice President of Consumer Insights and Strategy at Universal Studios Home Entertainment. And Dan is a longtime home entertainment research exec who basically has followed the consumer from VHS days to DVD, to Blu-ray, to 4K, and now to digital. I think that does a great job of summing up your background. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Susan. Glad to be here. It's been a long ride, and we've seen many changes throughout the industry.
We indeed have, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But Dan, can I ask you another background question, first of all? How
Sure.
did you get into research? Did you always know you're going to be a research professional, or did you stumble into research like is the case with many people?
I would say stumbled is probably most accurate. For my first job out of college, I was working more in the advertising industry. And one of our clients happened to be Universal. And so they had an opening, and I just fell into it. I mean, most people in the entertainment industry have a specific plan to get into entertainment. Me, it was just a matter of just kind of the right opportunity at the right time. So it was never my plan to get into entertainment. And now I've been here for more years than I like to talk about.
And you didn't have to do any waitering or anything like that to get into this.
No, none of the usual paths.
Very good. So Dan, thank you for joining me today to have this conversation about how to create impact, how to do good, impactful research, research and consumer insights, basically. But talking about the flip side of it, how we actually fail at creating impact, specifically when, research basically does not work. I love that you chose to pick this topic because it's not something that a lot of my guests would want to talk about, because we always want to talk about the kind of the positives. But I think with your experience, with your background, our audience will learn so much about some of the harder to discuss or kind of the uglier sides of when things don't work. So really, really curious and kind of excited about this conversation. My first question is going to be based on a lot of, years of experience on the corporate side, on the brand side. What are some of the characteristics that you would consider to be necessary to be impactful, to have impactful market research or consumer insights project? What is necessary for impact in our line of work?
I would say from my point of view on the client side, the most important thing to make sure your research is going to have impact is to make sure when you're looking at questions, you're looking at things that are meaningful. That sounds kind of obvious, but I think that there's a real difference between things that are interesting and things that are meaningful. A lot of times you can fall into a trap, and a lot of times it's, the people you're working with, your stakeholders, they're looking for answers, but sometimes they're looking for answers to things that might turn out to be interesting but aren't really that useful. And so I think, the discipline is really trying to figure out, when you're talking to your stakeholders about a project, how is this going to be used? Because a lot of times that question can trip somebody up. Like, they hadn't really thought about how they were going to use it. They just know it'd be interesting to know, why is the consumer doing this? Why are they doing that? Like, well, do we know what the use case is for that answer? So to me, it's always about making sure what you're doing is useful, instead of just finding things that are interesting.
You just went straight to the to the core of it there, Dan. Like, having grounded meaning, like actual, useful, practical, here's that word, actionable kind of value. And it starts with having that conversation early on and making sure, right, that it's not just a nice to know, or I'm interested, or this or that executive had a curiosity about something, which never happens. Yes,
because right? there's a lot of curiosity in the organization, and we have to find a way to move beyond curiosity.
Right. And I think, do you think that's researchers' job only, or do you think that's kind of like a two-way street where marketing or some other stakeholder team should also hold themselves accountable to make sure that, whatever comes out of the research, that they have a way of acting on it, doing something with that information, with that insight?
That's a challenging question. In an ideal world, we can say, yes, your stakeholders are all very buttoned up and understand the best way to use research, but we very rarely live in an ideal world. So it's kind of a two-way street. You have to be, part of being a researcher in a large organization is you have to be willing to train some of your stakeholders about how to use research. Right. What's the best kind of research? I mean, like the worst case example is when you have somebody come and you say, I want to do a focus group, and then they describe what they want to know, and it's very quantitative. Or I want to do a survey, and they describe something that's very qualitative. So there has to be some education on our part with our stakeholders to make sure they really stay buttoned up and on point.
Right. Absolutely. In those instances, Dan, when we don't have those hard conversations or the conversations up front about what are we going to do with this information, what are some of the situations or the reasons for when projects actually fail, right? Or things don't work out, or the results come out and really nobody does anything with them, and it just kind of gets filed away, and we move on to the next thing. What are some of the reasons that you've seen that are kind of causes, overt or not very obvious sometimes too, causes for why things are not going to work, why things are not going to be effective and impactful?
Well, I've never really had the experience of a project going wrong, but I've heard stories from other people, so I'll share some of that. No, obviously we've all had many experiences of a research project that's, for whatever reason, it goes wrong. At the end of the day, you look back and it didn't have the impact you wanted it to. What's interesting to me, I think, as I was thinking about this question, it almost never comes down to things like survey design or sampling or analytics. It always comes down to the very beginning of the project. And I think every project I've had that has been a failure or has been a great success, that was always defined right at the beginning of the project. How well you define your objectives, how clear the objectives are, how much alignment you have with your stakeholders. That, to me, has always defined, is this going to be a successful project or not? And as we just talked about, it's really about talking to your stakeholders, training your stakeholders. And when you work for a large organization, you can have lots of different stakeholders in different departments. So they're going to have different agendas, and building that consensus and to make sure everybody, one, knows what the objective is, everybody agrees with the objective, and the objective is one that's not too broad, too vague, but is very specific, and one where there are natural outcomes to that. Those are the projects that are going to be successful and probably going to be successful rather quickly. When everybody's aligned on, we know why we're doing this, we know what questions we need answered, and we know what we're going to do when we get these answers.
And that's brilliant, Dan, because a lot of this is so proactive, almost like at the very beginning before the project even starts, right? And the curious thing for me has always been, even in some situations where you have really good experts, like with lots of experience, lots of knowledge of how the organization works and who the stakeholders are and what they want, etc. But sometimes they still actually don't take the time to do that, don't really invest that, upfront kind of time and effort. They just dive into, the technical aspects, the methodology, all the things we need to do to make sure it's the execution, right? And it's an afterthought in those situations. Like, you do the whole research, you get the report, and then you're like, oh, yeah, what are we going to do with this, right? That's the question, right? So why is it so hard to think about these things up front? And why do we sometimes not do it? And I say we collectively, all of us have been there in the past.
Right. I mean, some of it's just laziness, Sometimes it's easier just to go through the simple steps. I mean, getting stakeholders together, getting people with different points of view together and agreement. It's work. It's hard. It's something that may not even come natural for a researcher. Things like deciding on sample size, deciding on methodology. These are things that we're more trained in, may come more naturally, may come more easy. And so, and those things are honestly, they're kind of more objective. Like, all right, what's my budget? How many people? These are things that are really easy to do. And so you kind of gravitate towards that. So a lot of this is just, you have to kind of fight against your instincts. Say, no, before we go down this path, because I've got, the head of marketing calling me saying, I want to do a research study on this and I need the results by then. And then you kind of go into that mode of, all right, hurry up, let's get that. And instead of saying, no, we have to stop. We have to do this right. We've got to take some time to really define, why are we doing this? What are we going to do with the answers? And so sometimes it's just kind of stopping that train that's already started. And you've got to get everybody just to kind of take a moment. And that can be challenging at times.
I love the analysis there about, like, that's just not typically in the nature of an average researcher, because we just thrive on the technical aspects, right? Like the sample size, all of that. But what I call the people aspects, like what happens when we get this data, that's not even, I don't even know, maybe that is taught in schools or not, but where should new researchers or consumer insights people, when should they start to think about this? I mean, obviously, Dan, you're a senior executive and, you have the gravitas, the position, the ability to really stop and kind of zoom out and ask these questions up front. What would be your advice for, kind of more younger, I don't want to say younger, but more junior, like up and coming or professionals who are on their like career track that are still growing? How can they kind of introduce this moment of pause and big picture thinking at the front without looking like they're slowing things down or they're asking questions, above their pay grade or whatever? How can we instill this kind of culture a lot more in our next generation of researchers?
Well, something I did that I thought was very helpful, I noticed in the creative department, they had a worksheet, and whenever someone needed something from the creative department, they had to fill out this worksheet, which would talk about, what were the objectives, what were they trying to achieve, and all of these things. I'm like, wait a second, I think I can steal that idea. And so that's exactly what I did. I took their worksheet and just, changed it to be more research oriented, but that's really what it is. Like, when someone comes to you and say, great, I'm happy to work on your project, please fill this out. Because sometimes just a simple act of getting a stakeholder to just actually commit to something in writing is a really good start to making sure your project's going to be on track. Because now they have to stop, they have to pause and really think about, all right, well, what do I need to know? I mean, sometimes the most obvious question, the first question on there is, who do we need to talk to? And they haven't even thought about that yet. And so getting them to just kind of stop, take a breath, say, all right, who do I need to talk to? What do I need to ask them? What am I going to do with this? Very simple, straightforward questions, but having that discipline to say, all right, we're not going to start this project until this is filled out can make a huge difference.
Great. So kind of like they call it the creative brief, right?
The creative brief, exactly. Yeah.
And
I just stole that. I deleted the word creative. I wrote in research.
I love that. I think it's a great tip. I don't know how many, like I'm trying to think about my clients. I don't know if any of them really have something like that. But taking that idea to kind of to the next level, Dan, what if we're dealing, with a situation where things are really unknown? For example, you're looking at some new idea, some new product, I don't know, some new solution. God, like there's so much change in the marketplace, right? All companies, regardless of industry, they're always dealing with a lot of unknown. So even though you might have these conversations up front and, everyone agrees like, okay, we want to do XYZ thing these are the reasons, but nobody really knows what's going to come out, or it's a little bit more exploratory, or, there might not be perfect kind of vision for what the action might be for that research. What is a good way in your experience to navigate those gray situations, like gray areas where it's not very clear what is going to come out and what the team at marketing or creative or whoever it might be, the stakeholder, what they're going to do with it?
I think the first thing to know is research is done for different reasons. And when you're doing a research project, you got to make sure you understand what the reason is. And let's be honest here. Sometimes research are done to support a decision that's already been made. Or sometimes the research it's been done to support one person's point of view versus another person's point of view. Or sometimes, like you say, it is truly exploratory. It's not designed to drive an immediate decision. And so the first step is, in any research project, let's make sure we understand why we're really doing this, what the motivation is. And then when you get everybody aligned in that, then we want to understand when we get back something that's going to be, as you said, more gray or more exploratory, there still should be some people that are going to action on that in some way. Is this going to be something we're going to turn over to our creative department to explore further? Is this something people who are going to be in our technology department are going to be looking at? So there should be a plan in place, even if there's not a specific decision to be made. So the next steps are going to be what we get this. Who's going to take this and do what the next step is? It can't be, all right, now that we've got this back, who wants to take this now? That decision should already have been made before you started.
So it's almost like, how we talk about product life cycle. We need to talk about the entire life cycle up front. And, part of that could be like non-decisions, right? We decide to not do anything because research went a particular direction, like the findings went into a particular direction. But having those conversations up front, even though they might be hard because nobody really knows what's going to come out or what the answer might be.
And it's always possible that the research come back and the plan changes, right? And then you have to do 180, but you should at least have a plan in place. So we know, we were going to do this, and now that we got our answers, at least when you're pivoting from something to something else. Right.
Yeah, and one of the barriers, I think you and I have in the past have talked about this, is when, a research project is greenlit and there are findings that come out that are not in support of kind of the general desired direction, by the team or even the company, so on and so forth, right? So in those situations, it's easy to say, oh, the research was bad. That's why no one took any action on it. As opposed to, well, research was good. It didn't show us what we wanted, so we're going to ignore it, kind of, right? This doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen every now and then.
It happens all the time. What are you talking?
So what is one supposed to do in that situation, right? Like, how do you navigate I don't want to know this truth. I want to believe in my own truth, and I'm going to insist on it. I'm going to bend the numbers, or, that's a very strong statement there, but kind of denying whatever the truth is and poking holes at it. Is it statistically significant? How many people? Is it represent?
Yes. I love that question. Is it statistically significant? What's your sample size? Yeah. It's funny. You never asked me that when you agree with the findings.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is definitely one of the hazards of being a researcher, is that sometimes you have to deliver unpopular news. And so the first thing to know is in your organization, as you're looking at the results, and this is where the more well integrated the research department is into the organization, the better it's going to be. You have to really know your stakeholders, and yet not just know who they are, but know what their day-to-day is like. So when you're putting together a presentation, I know for a fact, I have this slide, and I know one person is not going to like this, right? Finance is not going to like slide 3. Marketing is not going to like slide 4. Sales isn't going to like slide 6, right? You have to know this stuff going, and there's nothing worse than giving a presentation and not knowing what the reaction is going to be. Then you're going to have a real problem. But if you've done your homework ahead of time and you understand your stakeholders and you build your presentation, you can build your presentation knowing what's going to be controversial and say, here's something that's going to be controversial. Here's something we may not have anticipated, but let's take some time and understand why the consumer is telling us. Because a lot of people would like to, the consumer's wrong, consumer's lying. No, consumers are telling this for a reason. We got to figure out what the reason is, why they're saying this. There is a truth here that we need to understand. And so the most important thing is first acknowledging, I understand this is not going to be popular with finance. This is going to be a much more expensive solution than we thought, but this is why it's going to be worthwhile. Or I understand why sales may not like this because of this, but this is why we think this is the right. So if you can present things like that, understanding what the pushback is going to be from whatever the stakeholders are, then you can craft a better story that people can get behind.
Excellent. I think the whole integration part is so critical to be able to even come to that point, Dan. And a lot of times people feel like, oh, I'm under marketing. This is how we report, right? We're a function or a team that supports marketing. So that's all I need to care about, right? But the circles outside of marketing, senior management, finance, my favorite one, or legal, right? All these other kind of stakeholders, understanding how these groups are interconnected and how the products or whatever it is that the company is producing get out through the entire system, and who is going to need what from that research, right? So that they're all...
Right. And I think it's important to understand, every department has their role in an organization. Every department's going to have their point of view, and they're all valid. We're all working towards the same goal at the end. Just because we have a different approach, a different point of view, and you have to acknowledge that. Understand, finance might be shooting some things down. They're trying to keep costs down. That's their goal. That's their role. But let's have a conversation with them about how, in the long run, we think this is actually going to be better for the bottom line, and give some reasons why this is going to be better for the bottom line. So you need to understand the language your stakeholders speak, because they all speak a slightly different language, and you have to be able to speak that to them.
Absolutely, I love that. The language, the cross-functional languages, as well as something, again, not a lot of clients or not a lot of corporate side, brand side folks will like to talk about. It's the kind of the hidden agendas, right? When they fill out a brief, or when you have an upfront meeting and say, here's what we're going to do, but really knowing kind of what drives the business, the key business drivers, right? Are those stated requirements of, I want to find out the PI on this or whatever it is, right? Are those aligned with the business drivers, or are they going against the business drivers, right? Basically, to me, knowing the business inside out, knowing the players, knowing the geography, knowing how everything is connected to each other is actually a critical responsibility of the research team. But a lot of research teams don't do that, Dan. I'm not going to say they're completely isolated over there, but they're like, that's not my responsibility to give you you go figure out how you're going to kind of navigate through the rest of the organization with that data.
Sometimes that happens. It's the way the organizations are set up, where research is kind of set up on an island, and sometimes it's for the best intentions. Like, we want research to be as objective as possible, so we're going to set them up on an island, and that instinct is right. You want research to be objective, but they also need to be integrated, because if you walk into meetings where you're presenting findings and you don't understand the structure, the way things work. I mean, I remember early on in my career, I had a vendor come in, gave a presentation, and like their big takeaway was, you guys need to do this. And this was something that was technically illegal. Like, all right, the FTC is not going to allow us to do that. So this big takeaway is really not going to work. And so that's kind of an extreme example, but you never want to be in the position of kind of your big takeaway, your big recommendations or something the organization literally cannot do, either for legal reasons or other reasons. So you've got to make sure you understand that, or your research is just going to be, all right, that's interesting. Not much we can really do with that, and it's going to end up sitting on the shelf, because you have to know what types of decisions people are making on a day-to-day basis. Because at the end of the day, if research is working well, research is helping the organization make better decisions. And so if you don't know what decisions are getting made, it's really hard to give people information that's going to help them make better decisions.
So the question I was going to ask is, Dan, sometimes organizations end up doing same research on the same topic 500 times, like years, right? What are some of those contributing factors in those situations where either the topic is really big, maybe that's why it needs, a lot of research, but it also feels like by now we should have answered, right? By now we should have figured out what the right thing to do, what the right action items are on this particular business issue. Do you feel like research has a role in eliminating those situations, or do you feel like that's just part of kind of the natural flow of some of the biggest business decisions or biggest trends, like market trends in the world, like things going digital, for example? It feels like some of these questions are always there. Clients are always asked questions, but they're not taking action on. When they do the research, when they get answers, they're not taking action on them. What do you, in your experience, in your observations of other brands or clients, et cetera, other situations, how do you think is at play in those situations?
It's an interesting question. I'm thinking through my career and the number of times I'm involved with certain questions that get repeated over and over again. And I think sometimes the background is different. Sometimes I think the idea is that people don't like the answer they're getting, so they keep asking and hoping the answer is going to change. Quite frankly, it's particularly if there's something we're doing that's very expensive, and people just want to keep asking that question again. Do we still need to keep spending money? Yes, it still matters. We still need to keep spending the money. Another one was a really big kind of change in the marketplace that we spent a lot of time researching. We asked a lot of questions. Part of that was just because of the dramatic impact it was going to have. There was a lot of stops and starts. Just some of it was due to legal reasons, due to mergers and acquisitions that sometimes happen in this industry. And so it was a question that got asked a lot of different times and in a lot of different questions, in a lot of different countries, I mean. Ultimately, we got to an answer, and it turned out to be very successful, but it took a long time to get to that answer just because there was a lot of hoops to jump through, a lot of external factors. External factors can sometimes cause things to change, where if you're making a decision, it's just your company's decision. But if you're working with other companies to do something, that adds a layer of complexity. And if that company changes their mind and now you're going to partner up with somebody else, now you got to do the research again. Or if you're trying to convince other people to join you, sometimes we have to do more research the way they want to do it, so they'll find credibility in it. So sometimes it's just you're doing something that's very complicated with partners, and sometimes it's just that people keep hoping that answer is going to change.
Yeah. Good. Very good. Very insightful. Thank you, Dan. Lots of kind of ways to think about that situation. So obviously, with your extensive experience, Dan, some of these things that we discuss are easier, right? You've done it for years, you kind of have those skills, the natural kind of people orientation already, also something you have. But let's talk about, to those in our audience who might not have some of that experience under their belt, what advice would you have to those folks in particular, or obviously to the greater research and consumer insights industry, in terms of upgrading their best practices, their approach, their standards to research to make sure that it makes a difference, that it drives that actual impact for their brand, for their target market, for their teams, honestly, for themselves as well. I guess more of a kind of like a summary question or kind of like a bring it all together type of a question. What is the advice from someone in your position with your years of experience, Dan?
I would say the first thing is take some time to get to know your stakeholders. Nothing's really going to replace that. A simple thing of asking people to lunch, just, because generally in an organization, people like to talk about their job. They like to talk about what they do. Take advantage of that. So spend some time with people, understand what they're doing, understand what their job is. From that, almost naturally, research's role in helping them will come about. So make sure you understand, what are they struggling with? What do they wish they knew that they don't know? And the more you understand that from everybody in the organization, the better you're going to be. Second's going to be, insist on precise objectives. And the word insist is really important there because it can take a lot of time to really get to a precise objective.
Right.
Because you're going to have people who have different ideas. You're going to have people that sometimes are intentionally keeping things vague because, I want to know this, I want to know this, or sometimes projects can just get too big because what happens is, particularly in organizations where budgets are tight, as soon as people find out there's a research project happening, that everybody wants a piece of it, right? You're going to interview people? Well, ask them this, ask them this, and now you have 20 different unrelated questions, and when that comes back, none of that is going to be actionable or meaningful. So again, you have to have that discipline to say, look, this is what the objective is. If it doesn't fit the objective, we can't ask it. No, we can't just tack it on the end. No, because if I tack on yours, I'm going to tack on everybody else's. So those kind of things can really take it the wrong way. So as I talked about earlier, this kind of idea of stakeholder training, I think is really important, just to really make sure people understand fundamentals like what's the right use of a quant survey versus a qual survey, things like that. Why the objective is so important. Why understanding what you want to do with the research once we're done with it is so important. Because sometimes you have to have that question, like, all right, so I know we kind of have this hypothesis. We're going to ask this, and it's going to go here, and everybody's sort of assuming like, what's going to happen if the research tells us the opposite? If you can have that conversation before you even start and people kind of think about that, okay, well, in that case, we would do this. That's going to help you. And then the last thing I would say is just build consensus in the organization before you begin, because there's nothing worse than giving a presentation where some people thought the objective was A and some people thought the objective was B. That's going to be a really ugly presentation for you. You've got to make sure everybody is bought in to what you're doing. Right.
And that's a whole lot of amazing summary there, Dan. The last one in particular, building that consensus, whether it's cross-functionally or across senior management, etc. And a lot of researchers, again, they think that's the sponsor's job, right? Whoever's sponsoring the research. But there is a math there that even if it is in a company where that function belongs to the sponsor, like the head of marketing or whoever it might be, it'll still come back on the research team if it has not been thought ahead of time, thought through completely, even if it is somebody else kind of doing that job of making sure everybody's aligning around the results, etc.
Yeah, because one thing is true. At the end of the day, if the organization spends a lot of money on a research project and they realize there was no action taken in the research project, that everybody's going to remember that research person wasted $50,000, and they don't remember anything else that happened.
That is so true, Dan. And it's not just on that research person or on that research team. It's on the entire industry, right? Because that might happen twice in one company, but across many companies, that happens all the time. And I think that is one of the ways, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we as stewards of the research industry and the brand of the work that we do, like the work of market research or consumer insights, etc., we have to be responsible. We have to take a lot more ownership of that. Make sure that if one project goes south because of we haven't thought about all the right pieces ahead of time, it's a bad poor reflection on everybody, honestly, and a loss of, tremendous amounts of dollars and resources. Very good. Dan, is there any other impact related question that you think I should ask that I'm not asking in terms of how to make things more impactful or how to avoid potential traps or, potential kind of pain points or reasons for failure when you want to create good, impactful research outcomes?
I think what you touched on, and I think what is important, is to use the phrase people skills. And I think that's the thing that's often overlooked. When you think about researchers and what skill sets you need in a researcher, you think about analytical, you think about people who can crunch numbers, and you almost never think about people skills with a researcher. And I think ultimately, if you want to have impact, you have to have the people skills as well. That's really what's going to make the difference between information that is just a deck full of numbers and stuff that's really impactful as an organization. You have to have the people skills to make that happen.
Love that. No amount of AI or, beautiful dashboard or whatever the thing is, right? Without the person accompanying you who's going to talk to another person about it, I think is sufficient for good, impactful decision-making, especially when the business decisions are complex, right? Very good. Dan, I asked 3 questions at the end of all of our conversations with our esteemed guests, and I would love to ask those questions of you too. The first one is, we talk so much about impact, obviously, in this call, but I think as an expert, you think about it all the time in your day-to-day. But tell me something that you do, like a small thing that you do in your daily life with your family or colleagues, etc., that create positive impact, within your community, within your work community, or within the world, like more broadly in the world. Anything that you want to share with us?
There's a couple of organizations I work with that I will call out. One is called Ahead with Horses. What they do is they work with disadvantaged, disabled, special needs kids, and they use equine therapy, which means horseback riding, to kind of help them. And so my son has been going there for a long time. And so it's a really great organization. So I'd like to help them out. Another one is called PWCF, which stands for Prader-Willi California Foundation. This supports people with Prader-Willi syndrome, parents, kids, works with doctors to help educate people. For people who don't know, which is probably everybody, doesn't know what this is, Prader-Willi syndrome. It's a rare genetic disorder. It affects growth, metabolism, appetite, behavior, development. It's also the most common genetic cause for obesity. My son has this. Is how I became aware of it. And when we talked to my pediatrician, he said I'd never heard of that. So that tells you kind of the work that needs to be done just in creating awareness of this. So PWCF is doing a great job along that. So we work with them as well.
Very good. Thank you. I have to say, of all the guests I've talked to so far, best answer to that first question. The second question I have along the same lines, what would you encourage folks who are listening to this episode to do in order for them to have, more positive impact in their lives, in the world, in their work, beyond just supporting these 2 organizations that you just mentioned?
I would say get off of social media and get out into the world. That's my number one piece of advice. Because really, there's nothing better than getting together in person with a group of people, try to achieve a common purpose, whatever that purpose is. I don't care. But if people just getting together, working together on something, not just clicking and liking and whatever, but actually in person working on something, and there's plenty of things out there that can be done. I mean, the company I work for is really good about constantly sending us volunteer opportunities, and there's just an incredible range from, cleaning up the beaches to helping young screenwriters to just getting school supplies to disadvantaged kids. We get all of this stuff, and they're all great. So I would say, find something like that. Whatever it is you think you can help somebody with, because everybody is an expert in something. And so find that, share that with people, and hopefully do it in a more of an in-person setting.
I love that. So reconnect with others and find a common purpose to serve. Very good. Dan, this has been, even though I've known you for so many years, this has been actually very, very enlightening. Thank you.
I'm glad. This has been a lot of fun.
If I had, if people want to find you or get in touch, what's the best way to do that? Where would you want them to go? How can folks find you if they wanted to?
Just find me on LinkedIn.
Dan Casey?
That's the easiest way. Just Dan Casey. There's a lot of Dan Caseys out there, so find Dan Casey, who works for Universal Pictures Home Entertainment. Make sure you get that one, and that will be me.
Very nice. Very good. Well, Dan, thank you so much for a very informative but also fast and fun discussion on topics that most researchers either don't talk a lot about or don't like to talk about, because they'd rather spend a lot more time on the technical aspects of the work that we do, such as significance testing and sample size. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I wanted to say thank you again. I hope you had some fun too.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been a great discussion. I really like this forum you have. So
great.
I'd be glad to come back anytime.
I was just going to say, maybe we'll pick another juicy topic later in the year and we'll do it again.
Any unpopular topics you have, give them to me. I'm happy to tackle them.
Very good. I love it. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. As you heard in this episode of All About Impact, it takes a great deal of people skills and strategy planning to actually create impact with research. How are you approaching your impact creation? Are you even thinking about impact upfront or at all? Impact is the next dimension of research and insight, and it is possible with the right partner alongside. Reach out to me, Susan Patoyan, on LinkedIn, and let's discuss how we discover the impact champion in you. Tune in next week for another episode of All About Impact.